And he was talking about how it's not just that, he can't talk about political things on the phone, but that like it's made him feel trapped. And he also told me he has trouble like writing about his feelings. Like he can't bring himself to keep a diary because it's made him so afraid that someone's always going to be looking at what he says. So he feels like there's no place where he can express himself privately, even within his own bedroom. And he says it's a form of trauma. So in addition to surveillance, there's this problem of just bluntly shutting off service. So this is, I don't think you can see all the details here, but this is a timeline of the communication shutdowns in Cairo during the 2011 revolution. And there was sort of this gradual tapering off of different types of services, like at first kind of targeting activists, and then the whole city, and then the whole country. First Facebook, then BlackBerry, then SMS. No SMS worked, and then no internet, no phone. And this was like, it was kind of interesting. It caused a lot of fear and confusion, a lot of difficulty coordinating, a lot of difficulty reaching doctors and lawyers and human rights protectors, and certainly it was very hard for journalists to get information out. It also had this strange sort of counter effect where people started to worry about their friends who were like out at the protest. And so more and more people like went out into the street, and the protests grew in size, even though it was harder to coordinate. So things became more localized and became more, in person as a result of that. And then, like, similarly in Turkey during the Gezi Park protests, and since, this is still happening there, Twitter, Facebook, Wikipedia, WhatsApp, platforms like these that are kind of like widely used communication platforms often receive requests by the Turkish government to shut down anytime there's an election, anytime there's a big protest. Then they comply to greater or lesser degrees. So this is, there's this website called Turkey Blocks that does these probe analysis of all these websites that get shut down, all these platforms that get shut down. And they do it really, really regularly so that they can see like exactly at what moment, like Wikipedia goes down in Turkey, the access to French Wikipedia goes down, access to like US Wikipedia goes down. And they keep track of this, but it's really hard to do much about it other than keep track of it. So in addition to making it hard to share information with the wider world, it also really puts people in peril. So this is a quote from an Egyptian activist who was arrested during the Tahrir occupation. And he was talking about kind of like the consequences of shutting down this kind of connectivity. And he says it was the first time he really he was arrested and there was no phone service in the square. And they took him away from the square, and he had smuggled another phone with him, and he was able to use it. But while he was in there, until they took the van out of the square, he couldn't reach anyone. And he realized that anything could have happened to him. And he said, this was my first encounter with the realization that they have the power to disconnect you, and you will suffer the consequences. You can just disappear. And this also, it's an effective way of sort of threatening a population. It's also an effective way of making it really hard to coordinate a large assembly, to make cohesive actions, and to organize anything, from a march to a vote. So when this happened, these movements all had to figure out different ways of dealing with both protecting themselves and communicating within the movement. And I'm going to talk first of all about kind of like in-person communication and decision-making methods that kind of had less to do with security threats and more to do with how to practice democracy. So one of the things they did was they started to use these like just analog assembly-based methods of discussing that were only accessible to people who showed up because they were just within the assembly. And this gave rise, I'm going to claim that this gave rise to a focus on listening as a way of attending to each other without screens and as a practice for making a public coalesce. And especially in 15M, Occupy, and Nuit Debout, these movements where they were kind of like experience a bit less external repression and had a bit more time to experiment with democratic practice, they had these common rules for listening that governed group discourse in public space. One was this practice called active listening. One was the use of a consensus process. And I'll talk a little bit about this thing called the people's mic that was used in Occupy. Has anyone ever heard of this? One person? All right, cool. Well, I'm excited to tell you about it. All right, so this active listening thing it's this way of listening that a lot of lefty organizations try to practice. That is focused on understanding the speaker's perspective and reaching a synthesis of ideas. So it's got this like deeper idea about what democracy is and how you come to ideas, and it's about like really trying to understand the other person rather than debating with the other person. So instead of like preparing your argument against this person, you really try to take their point of view and try to see what they mean. And then summarize it back in your mind to yourself. And a lot of these movements had like websites and flyers kind of explaining how you can do this and how you can start to like, while you're listening, think about listening in this way. And in addition to this, they had like methods for organizing time and organizing listening within a meeting. So sometimes things were timed, sometimes like people had to take turns speaking. Sometimes they used this thing called progressive stack, where people who were less likely to speak, hadn't spoken before, or were from demographics that were not usually dominant, like women or people of color, they were always allowed to speak first. And I interviewed this guy who was the head of one of the methodology working groups in 15M, and he said that horizontal democracy, right, like not having a hierarchy, and the ethics of listening to each other are like very deeply mixed together, and you need to like use these methods in order to improve your ability to really listen and understand each other. And then in terms of decision making, they had this practice that was based more on consensus rather than majority. So this is a decision-making practice that it was used in Occupy and 15M, but it has a much longer history. It goes back, it's like, comes from direct democracy. It goes back very far to like all sorts of groups in the 1600s and protest movements in the 1990s and communes throughout Europe. And the idea here is that people come to decision through working through a question, clarifying the issue, and like looking for new ideas instead of arguing with each other. And you know you've sort of come to something that everyone can live with or thinks is a good idea when most people are in favor of it and nobody's blocking it. But if anybody in the group thinks it's a really horrible idea, they can block it, and you have to keep working on the idea until no one's blocking it. It's very hard, it's very slow. And it really requires like a sense of collaboration and participation. And so in order to do this in these really large groups, they implemented these hand signals that were both for like participating in the discussion and also like saying what you think about the ideas that were being communicated. So you can ask to talk, you can give a direct response to what's being said, you can ask for something to be clarified. If someone's going out of the process that is like required by the meeting and not following the rules, you can call a point of order. And then regarding the actual content of what's being said, you can say that you agree or you don't agree, you oppose it, which is like strong but not stopping it, or you can block it. So this was kind of a way of offering feedback, just using your body with a large group of people. All right, and then even beyond the issue of deliberation, there was like the problem of like being heard, right? So if you have a huge assembly, some of these were like thousands and thousands of people, up to like 15 to 20,000 maybe. You need amplification tools. So most of them had some kind of technology to broadcast the voice. In New York City, at Occupy Wall Street, they didn't, because in New York you can't use amplified sound without permission from the police. And they never got this permission. And the way they decided to deal with it was to do this thing called the people's mic, which is like kind of amazing and kind of weird. It's a really simple way of transmitting a voice through a large group of people where like somebody speaks and everyone who hears this person who's like asking to be listened to repeats what they say. And then everyone who hears what they're saying, like in the circle around them, repeats what they say. And then everyone who hears them repeats what they say. And the voice sort of travels in concentric circles through the group, through this repetition. It can be kind of slow. It can be very interesting because in the process, it gets sort of like crystallized, like all of the unnecessary words drop out and like the message just goes through. So this was like a way of permitting speech that really required the group to be willing to participate. So if someone was saying something that was kind of like, you know, you didn't agree with, or you were uncomfortable with it, or you thought it was a bad idea, you might repeat it, but you'd like repeat it quietly, or you really wouldn't repeat it because it was just something you couldn't bring yourself to say. So that the ideas that were the strongest, or that the most people believed in, were the ideas that got the most amplification. So it's a really interesting thing where the ability to permit speech moves from the police to the collective. It also brought up a lot of challenges about like whether you should or shouldn't repeat an idea that you don't agree with, like who has the right to censor, and how to handle deliberation in a system where there's no hierarchy. So all of these things were kind of going on, and there were all these like different protocols that they developed to have conversations and make decisions, not using any digital technology. So I first wanted to think about this and try to figure out like, okay, what were the core values in this way of communicating? They were, if we wanted to like build digital protocols based on this, what would we base it on? They were collaborative and they were synthetic. Voice was distributed or rotating. And there were many nodes, right? It moved through many, many, many people in order to distribute the message. And also, and very importantly, it was really emotionally powerful and it bonded a lot of people together. So, not surprisingly, these assemblies had a lot of issues that came up from like these processes and how long it takes and how you have to be outdoors together in public space. So I'm going to talk a little bit about these problems and then how they tried to solve some of these problems with technology. So these problems included, or maybe stemmed from the fact that it was incredibly time-consuming. Gender dynamics arose that felt alienating for many because it just happens that confident men were the ones who were speaking a lot. It required physical co-presence, and this was hard for anyone with illness or disability. There is a problem of translation. It's based on the voice, but not everyone speaks the same language. And these movements had such a strong commitment to like welcoming the stranger and being diverse, but they didn't really have like the infrastructure in place to talk to lots of different people. And then finally, a lot of these occupations were illegal, so undocumented people were sometimes very hesitant to attend. So coming back to this idea of time, the idea that makes this assembly practice so awesome is that it's radically open to anyone who shows up. If you show up, you can participate as long as you follow the rules. And that means the primary requirement for participation was having the time to be there. And the main value was patience. So this guy that I interviewed, who was involved in one of the neighborhood assemblies in Madrid, he was juxtaposing the idea of parliamentary politics, which is a politics based on speech, to these assembly politics, which he said were based on listening. And he said the main virtue of this kind of political practice is patience. But then the imperative of time creates a hierarchy and can kind of work against inclusiveness because there aren't actually economic systems to permit people to have that kind of time. So the people who were able to participate were the people who had the luxury of time. And this quickly turned into a divide along class, race, and gender lines. It was hard for people who were working, especially people who were working many jobs, and it was an issue for people who were doing like caregiving or anyone responsible for domestic labor who had to kind of be at home. So I was interviewing this guy who was making field recordings of a protest camp in Madrid, and he said, I kept like, you know, you hear the chants and you hear the speeches, but I kept also hearing these little things like people making phone calls home, like the chickens telling people like, pick up the kids from school, or the chicken's in the fridge, can you take it out to thaw? And he said, I started to see that there was this whole rear guard of people supporting the activists who were like out in the public square. And I thought like, you know, he said part of the problem was that we weren't thinking about that. We weren't thinking about care and support and like who's doing that work and how important that work is to sustaining a social movement. And then this problem of translation came up over and over again. And some of the assemblies provided different forms of translation, sign language translation, different language translation. And they really tried to do this, but it was almost impossible to coordinate. Nuit Debout, which was the latest one that I studied, it came in 2016, was much more committed to it, I think, than the others, and really put a lot of effort into it. So these were the hand gestures that were used in Nuit Debout, and you can see that there are more gestures. And they include, in the bottom, there's a request for translation, demande de traduction, and then to this one, to the side of that, is a way to flag that you think someone's saying something discriminatory or sexist or racist. This didn't exist in the earlier phases of these movements. So I think we can see this as like a form of progress and a refinement that comes from these languages sort of moving through different iterations over many years. And then this problem of being outdoors was one that had to be solved. So you had to be outdoors for many hours. It took a toll on people, especially the elderly, children, people with illnesses, differently abled people. hard of hearing people couldn't participate in an assembly that was based on the voice. And they really tried to find ways to accommodate people, but there was just a limit to how much they could do. So this is a photo that one of the sign language translators took at Nuit Debout in Paris. It's two people doing tactile signing, which is a way of communicating if you can't see or hear, and the messages are transmitted through a language just by touching the hands. It's really, really beautiful. So this kind of worked, but they couldn't always be there, and the sign language translators could only work during daylight, and Nuit Debout happened at night, so as soon as the sun went down, they couldn't work anymore. And I think I'm going to use this problem of sunset to pivot to the need for technology. They needed lights, they needed amplification. And this other guy I interviewed in Spain, he said, this practice of patience, it needs a material infrastructure. We need technology to be able to perform the kind of politics we're trying to do. They started developing some digital protocols for communication. And I've sort of classed these into three groups. There were algorithms and platforms for voting and deliberation and having conversation. There was sort of a lower layer kind of technology, local dark and mesh networks, like erecting your own internet locally. And in Cairo, they developed this really cool SMS hub that was even more basic than a network for sorting emergency text messages. So I'm going to talk about all of these. I'll start at the more deliberative layer, and talk about some of these algorithms and platforms. And in the end, we can talk a little bit about what they can and can't do, whether they really perform the same thing that a public meeting can perform. So this platform called Loomio was developed out of the Occupy movement in Wellington, New Zealand. And it's a decision-making app that basically uses the same process as the consensus process that was used in the meetings. And the person who developed it said that he decided to make it because of these problems that were articulated earlier on in this talk, that the longer you stayed in the meeting and the more the movement went on, it became less diverse. There was a lot of white male voices and not that inclusive at all, because those were the people who were comfortable talking, and those were the people who sort of had the economic privilege to stay around and had more free time. And so he thought, oh, okay, maybe I can make an app that people who don't have as much time or can't show up for the meeting or aren't as comfortable speaking up, these people can use it to participate in decision making. And so the idea was that it would act the same way that one of these meetings acted. So you gather a group together, you discuss a topic sort of in a thread, anyone can comment, and then you start a proposal and ask for responses that are the same as the hand gestures that were being used in these movements. And that's it. It's just this idea that maybe you can do the same thing, but you can do it remotely. So this is a company now. It's open source. It's run as a worker-owned cooperative. And it's used by a lot of sort of community groups and not-for-profits. In New Zealand, in Wales, and I know some in France that use it also. Another example, this is kind of amazing that it's happening. In Madrid and Barcelona, the city governments are now using this online process to propose, refine, and vote on local referenda. So this is the homepage for Decide Madrid, which is a website that like collects proposals for referenda. And anyone can propose anything. You can like propose to cut down all the trees in the city, and people can vote on it. That probably wouldn't get very far because it wouldn't be very popular. And the software for this is called Console, and it was designed by a group of engineers who were involved in 15M. And they were like working on the software to be used by 15M, and then it's been adopted by the whole city. And I interviewed the guy who's been working on it, and he's like really excited about it and really frustrated with it because he thinks it's not really good at doing synthesis of lots of different ideas, but it does like mobilize people to vote on things. And he said it was pretty successful at, like, the first vote was a referendum against the privatization of water, and they had 60,000 people on the first day. The next day, 170,000 people voted. And then there was a vote about healthcare. 1 million people voted on the first day, and it stopped the privatization of 5 or 6 hospitals in Madrid. So it's kind of like being used. And he's happy about that, but he said it's not good at doing like intelligent thinking yet. And that like you have all these different proposals and all you can do is say yes or no, but you can't like deliberate and come to new ideas in the way you would in a meeting. He really believes that you can make an AI that is capable of facilitating this. So that's what he's working on right now. And we can talk about whether we think that's possible and whether we think that's good. And he also like wants to design it so that there's no administrator, because he thinks it's really important that it's non-hierarchical. And so he's like, how do we make up some sort of like system that allows like ideas about what's best for the society to emerge, but like doesn't have a team of like engineers running it and turning it on and off. And it needs to be semi-permanent, it needs to not disappear like these occupations disappeared, but it also needs to be like non-hierarchical, but somehow sustainable. We don't know the answer yet, but these are the questions. Right, so the idea with these protocols is that they're all open source. Ideally, they're collaboratively authored. They're accessible to diverse users who might not be comfortable attending assemblies. And they want to be flexible so that the decision-making goes through lots of different phases and iterations. Right, so I'm going to talk now a bit about these networks that were designed. So in the movements that were, I'm sort of like moving down in terms of like who's experiencing the most repression. And in the movements where there were more like shutdowns and blockages and slowdowns, they focused less on like the platform layer, less on making apps, and more on like making their own infrastructure because they were losing their infrastructure. And this was happening in Occupy in New York and sort of throughout the US to some extent. And one of these projects was this thing called the Freedom Tower, which is really ironic because the New World Trade Center is now called the Freedom Tower, but they have no relationship to each other. The Freedom Tower was an antenna, basically, that created a localized internet service for the camps. The first one was built by this guy, Isaac Wilder, in New York City for Occupy Wall Street. And then there was one in Austin, there was one in LA. They sort of popped up around the country. And they're based on this architecture called a mesh network. And the way it works is basically like a tower connects to the internet. You like sort of like put it somewhere where it can reach the capital I, like the big international internet. And then it sends the signal to a bunch of other like lower power laptops that act as routers that send the signal around to everyone else. So you no longer need to each one of you being connected to the internet. It's fine if just one person connects and then it's dispersed to everyone. And each device can like act as a sender and a receiver. So you also don't need to connect to the big internet. You can just have a network that's like among us. And all of our devices, our laptops, our phones are capable of being senders and receivers. And there's not necessarily a need to connect to corporate telecom if we're just trying to communicate amongst ourselves. So another project that happened at Occupy was this thing called Occupy Here, which was an offline, it was like a message board and like a little network for people in the vicinity of the assembly. It didn't connect to the internet at all. It had its own little dark net, basically. And so it's sorted just by like who was around. Whoever was in the vicinity could join and could like get on this message board and talk to each other. So this is a image from like trying to go to this website when you're not physically nearby and you get an error message. So I interviewed the guy who made it, and he said he was trying to like reflect the cool thing about Occupy was that people who wouldn't normally meet each other could have a conversation. It was just based on proximity rather than like already knowing each other or like having similar friends or similar social groups. So he was trying to create a network that was based on that. The thing about that was it wasn't very widely adopted because people were just like talking to each other in real life most of the time, and the internet was like coming and going. So like some people were using it, but you didn't need it that badly, and like you could mostly just hang out in the square and talk to each other until there was like a big altercation with the police. So it wasn't so necessary. A similar project for routing SMS messages came out of Tahrir Square, and it was like hugely well adopted. Everyone was using it. It wasn't like prefigurative. It wasn't like trying to imagine a new network. It like actually needed to be used because everything was shut down and there were a lot of emergencies. So the members of the communication team at Tahrir Square who I talked to told me that they were like already thinking about this problem of an internet shutdown as early as 2009 because they'd seen it happen so much in other countries, especially Pakistan and Zimbabwe. And so they kind of like developed a plan. They had a few different plans, but the one that they implemented was this sort of ad hoc, localized SMS hub that they used a combination of some open source software and hardware hacks and like somebody's laptop and somebody's cell phone, and they made something so that like if you were in the actual occupation, like in that square, and had a phone, even though cell service was down, you could get on this network and you could send messages. And it was like they had to prioritize connecting doctors, lawyers, and researchers and journalists to protesters in the occupation. So what happened was like text messages were sent to a certain number, and then they were filtered based on their content. And some of them were encrypted, and then they were automatically sent either to like the legal support team, to the medical team, to sort of like crisis counselors if there was a rape, and to trusted journalists. And then they kept like these secure encrypted archives that were sort of held within the tent there. It was a really awesome system that only lasted like 18 days until the revolution happened. And the people who made it said that it was sort of like, this is what we made in the moment because this was like what we needed. But we didn't like it politically because it was too centralized. It was like the few of us who were like in this tent working together. It was just going through like one guy's phone. It was like not our ideal. It was just what we did to solve the problem. It was really stressful. And one of the engineers I interviewed, he said, this isn't, we would have changed it if the revolution had like succeeded and sustained itself. What I really wanted was an infrastructure that was decentralized and non-hierarchical and uncensored, and that's what I wanted to build. And he believes that like this kind of a infrastructure is going to shape society in a way that is also non-hierarchical and decentralized. So in general, these were all like trying to be technologically distributed or not have like one central core antenna. Sometimes they were autonomous. They were only like local to the square or to the occupation. They were based on location rather than like friends or rather than whether you're part of a political party. And they were all open source. So I want to talk now about some of the problems that kind of emerge when we start to think about technology as a political solution, or these types of technologies as a political solution. And because there's been a lot of excitement around open source technology lately. There's been a lot of excitement around this word decentralized, if anyone's heard about blockchain. Has anyone heard about blockchain? Yep. Yeah, yes. Yeah, everyone's heard about blockchain. It's like technically, you know, a decentralized infrastructure. So we need to think a little bit about like, to what extent do these ways of designing things solve political problems? So open source tools, you know, anyone can go in and look at the code and fix it and change it and design it. This is awesome, but not anyone can do this because not everyone knows how to code, right? So there's a problem of like transparency and literacy and time. And this is a problem that like occurred in the assemblies as well, right? Just around different types of language. And then these distributed technologies that they move power away from one centralized node, right? So a mesh network moves power away from a central corporate antenna and distributes it to every device. So every device can send and receive messages. Something like blockchain moves power away from the bank. The bank is no longer keeping track of transactions or who has what money and who's buying what from whom, and like puts it in the hands of the computers, right? The computers keep track of that on their own, and there's a process of verification that is encrypted and distributed across everybody's computer. However, if we look at something like blockchain, what's happening there is that the sharing of the power is shared through the devices, right? So whoever has the most computing power has the most authority to keep track of transactions. Whoever has the most computing power is whoever has the most computers, which turns out to be whoever has the most money or the most weapons. And so it reiterates another power problem that it claims to solve, but actually it just kind of gets around the problem of like the state or the bank monitoring transactions, but it doesn't get around the problem of distributing power based on wealth. And then finally, there's this question of ethics and empathy and listening. So at the very beginning, I talked a little bit about how these groups had these core values of trying to understand each other and come to consensus and like really like not fight, but instead try to listen. and be diverse and different. And I think there is a question about whether or not it's possible to do that remotely, like whether we can really do that online, or whether we need to be in person and face to face. So I don't know the answer, but I do know, like, this is the question that arises right now for me, and maybe we can talk about it. So if the logic of the network doesn't equal the logic of the assembly, if the assembly, this kind of like public assembly politics, relies on strangeness, like you can't really have a public unless you have people who are strange to you and different from you. And this is like even more important under globalization. How do we think about the role of technology? So can these ethics of listening to each other that were so essential to structuring the process of direct democracy be translated into something remote, digital, or distributed? And I think like there's a bigger question here about the problem of globalization and the problem of these local social movements. So they're all fighting against like sort of authoritarian, repressive problems that were kind of wrought by global capital. And they're each fighting in their own cities, in their own way. They're all sort of like local and embodied in their practice. They're also often communicating with each other and like replicating each other's struggles and concerns until they lose their communication tools because they're shut down or they're not really working for their processes. So they have to find ways to scale up. And the question here is like the way one usually scales up is using technology. Yet the way one usually does direct democracy is in person. And it's a really slow, intimate process. So I think the question for us right now is to figure out like how to scale up these efforts and if we can use technology to do that. Okay, and that's it. Thank you very much.
So, we're going to have some Q&A. I being up here and in charge and in control, I get to ask the first question. Well, as you were speaking about sort of some of the deliberative processes of the squares and the idea of like arriving at consensus, just being from the region, what I imagined was the possibility and the real possibility of people who are part of the collective who are there to undermine the collective, whether provocateurs or various ways that a public can have anti-public kind of individuals within it, right? How is that resolved? Or I'm sure that comes everywhere.
Yeah.
What are some of the ways that was dealt with?
There are a few ways. I mean, one of the ways, like especially like Louis Debout especially, they're like so much more formal. I don't know if it's because they're French or if it's because they came last, but they like limited, in the general meetings, they limited speech to 3 minutes. And they also like had really strict rules against hate speech. So they had some control over the content. And if someone felt like you were sort of like causing problems, being hateful, or being like counterproductive, you could sort of there was this hand gesture that you could do to like force people to move along, and if enough people did it, you could sort of move that person away. So that was one process. And then another thing that happened is there were a lot of, in like almost all of them, eventually like a lot of the actual work moved from the General Assembly into smaller working groups. And in Madrid, what happened was they like dismantled the General Assembly and said we're only going to work in neighborhood working groups. And people got to know each other better, and it was a bit more efficient. In Paris, what they did is they had a whole decision process where you had a General Assembly, something was proposed, a working group was created to work on it. You went to the working group, and the working group came back with a solution at the next meeting, and then you discussed it, and then it could get sent back to the working group. So it kind of like, it made it so that the actual getting things done was kind of like, not exactly it was kind of like delegated out.
Like hyper-localized.
Yeah, yeah, to people who like really cared about working on that problem.
Cool. Do you want to say something about what's happening in France now?
It's interesting. I could say a lot of things. Yeah.
Is this becoming a part of the Yellow Jackets? I mean, are they going the route of these kind of popular social assemblies and all that?
I think it's just starting. So they kind of like, they did not really start on the left, and they were kind of just organizing through like making announcements on Facebook, and there wasn't really like a core, they didn't have like a home, there wasn't a square that they were meeting in. And now there are some groups that are participating that are starting to like build encampments and kind of do like mutual aid kind of things, or like starting canteens to feed homeless people, and they're kind of moving more in this direction to have like decision-making processes and like kind of home bases that are spread around France where you can go and like talk and make choices together. So it's starting, but it didn't begin that way.
I can ask one more questions. If you don't ask, I'll ask. Go ahead. Anybody have any questions? Specific, more general?
Thanks a lot for the presentation, and I just had a question. It's very kind of like a basic question about why the lineage of the protest movement, why you didn't kind of refer to Seattle movements, which actually, for some of us, or for people that have been involved in the US, the big anti-globalization movements that happened as a result of, Seattle and other, types of protests that started using those tools, that horizontalism, and even some of the ways of communicating around, whether it's consensus building or using hand gestures and, direct democracy, as you call it. So it seemed like it was missing from your presentation. I was wondering why. And maybe it wasn't as important in the context of technology or squares or whatever context you were using, but for me it was like a huge omission in discussing this issue.
Yeah, I just didn't have time to talk about that history because I'm trying to talk about what they're building next. But if you read my article, I do. No, and you're totally right. So like all of these hand gestures, as far as I know, they were developed in Seattle during the WTO protests. It was also like the rebirth of the Black Bloc, and like the first time like huge groups of people were coming together and figuring out communication processes for doing direct democracy.
It was also the advent of the independent media centers. The IMCs that's the kickoff to the IMCs, which were all based on non-hierarchical governance structures.
Yeah.
And did they do any FM radio banding? I know that, for example, that's a very effective way of not being surveilled if you control the setting up small portable FM radio stations for a particular bandwidth of people for information dispensation.
I don't know. I think they might have in Occupy, but I didn't nobody I talked to talked about that, but it's not to say it wasn't done. I mean, it is kind of like a moment now where people are more on their phones. So I think they were like trying to target that. But I don't know. There's probably something. I don't know. I can look it up. Or you can look it up.
Hi, my name is Hamad from SMEC. So, looking at this, and it's really taking me back to 8 years ago in terms of the political scene in the region. But also, one of the things that I feel that's missing a little bit is the companies and how strong they are, and how much they can manipulate speech online and content removal and all that. I mean, for example, when there was Black Lives Matter, it wasn't branding online as much as the bucket challenge, for example. So we can see how much Facebook manipulated the algorithm in a way that they let people focus on one theme of things and activities rather than see what's happening for the other activism that's been happening. That's one. Two, for example, I look at the region here. I mean, nowadays, it's really, there's a lot of bots. There's a lot of drones. I feel like the challenge is becoming much more complex, and there's a lot of involvement of corporation and surveillance and all that. Yeah, I just want to stop here.
I completely agree with you. I mean, it's missing from this presentation because the presentation is about how they design their own tools, right? It's not about how they use Facebook. But I think, yeah, the conversation about like how to do democracy using Facebook has to be a conversation now about like how public opinion is being manipulated by like trolls and content moderators that have like profit in mind rather than discourse.
Yeah, I mean, and also I don't think we can use democracy and Facebook in the same sentence anymore because they don't belong together. Because Facebook is a totally corporation that work on their own black hole algorithm that we don't have access to, and democracy is something else. So.
Yeah, I agree.
Follow up on a similar theme here is that there's a classic design question for any democratic system or any open protocol, that the more open, non-hierarchical that it is, that the more vulnerable to capture and co-optation it is at the same time. So rather than really want abstractions, I want to know in your experience with looking at these social movements up close and how people design communication systems when state infrastructure was down, did you see any elements of protection against capture and co-optation? Because of course, even the most democratic ideal system face-to-face, if it's not protected against such measures, it can easily just become a functionary of the thing it seeks to escape and can easily be a conduit to go right into the hands of its enemy. I'm
So
wondering if you've
you're
seen any of
talking
these
about,
protective measures.
like infiltration.
Well, just by the nature of being open,
Mm-hmm.
I don't even know if you can call it infiltration because it welcomes anyone and everyone, that it's easy to stagnate the movement or the cause. What kind of protective measures keep an open system moving towards its purpose if openness isn't inherent? Have you found any of these measures in your experience? It's one of the inherent contradictions of these issues.
Yeah. I mean, I think like there are like a few things to say, but there's not a broad answer. I mean, things like the system in Cairo is open source, but it's not like they have it up on GitHub, you know? And so the people who were participating, you know, they like had to be sort of internal. And it seemed to me that like the more sensitive the information was, the smaller the group was around it, right? Which is, you know, the same architecture that we see in like national security. And it's a struggle. I don't know if like, I heard different things. Like, so some of the engineers, especially in Cairo, like some people were like, no, we like need to have like a certain like hierarchy of privacy. And some people were like, no, like open source is like, it self-protects if enough people are participating. Like, you know, if someone adds a bug, somebody else takes it out. So, you know, some people believed in that. There are like really differing views. And it kind of like happened on the personal level too, where a lot of people, like some people felt like when there were real like human rights emergencies, like you had to have like a small group of people that you were protecting. And then some people felt that like we're always gonna have spies, but like we live with them. And like we are not gonna, like, there was this one guy I interviewed who was like, he said, you know, you can protect against external surveillance, but you can't protect against a spy coming in because that's like, we don't report on each other. And we don't wanna like have a paranoid environment in our group. And like, we'd rather live with the spies. And you know, maybe they'll change their mind someday. And he really believed that they had to live that way. So, yeah, I don't know. I don't think there's like a simple answer, but it is a thing that like people are debating over. Yeah.
Have you seen examples of some of those tools being used in exactly the opposite? So, like, we're talking about Untitled Chapter, it's like
Yeah.
a lot of, like, at least in Canada, let's say, it's, the English acts are very right-wing and racist,
Yeah.
as a label like that.
Yeah.
Have you seen, like, some of those tools that have been developed for, like, largely leftist purposes? Have you seen them being adopted by, like, because they're open source, adopted by, like, right-wing groups, like Reddit, for example, when it first
Yeah.
started,
Yeah.
was actually a very, like, ideally it was imagined by Ernst Schwartz as like a leftist, like a radically democratic way of organizing information on the internet, and now it's a cesspool of, like, discussing this, you know. So have you seen that symmetry being?
I mean, I haven't like with these particular tools, but I don't think like darknet, like there's nothing about a darknet that like makes it inherently democratic, right? What was democratic about like the Occupy Here case was that it was filtering based on location in a public square, rather than, I don't know, being like a international drug trafficking network or something like that. So I don't, it's like, I don't think you can say that like these tools necessarily cause democracy, but I do think you can say that like certain tools like are more useful for some groups than for others. You know, like, and the military loves mesh networks, but it doesn't love non-hierarchical structures. So they're not going to want to build something that's fully distributed. I think that's sort of been my.
And can I add that question?
Yeah.
So this is a little bit more meta, and I'm thinking about how. So in the literature about complexity theory, there's talk about how when you add technology to solve the problem, you're actually increasing the complexity of the problem. And you in your path, you diagnose like two paths. One is like an analog path, and another is a technical path, right? And like the question that I have is, like, do those tools actually hinder or help the purposes that they're created for?
Yeah.
Like the goals, the problems that do they actually solve the problems, or do they actually just make them more complex, requiring even more complexity to actually solve the new problems that are more complex?
I think it's not, well, I don't know complexity theory really, but I don't think it's about complexity, I think it's about scale. Does that make sense? Yes. But I don't know complexity theory. But it's like, we could probably refine a perfect direct democracy in this room together if we had a year and like were like fed and like totally cared for. Like we could probably get something pretty good going, right? We could solve a lot of problems. Except for the fact that like we're not going to be cared for, the lights are going to go out, nobody's feeding us, like there are like global infrastructural issues that impede upon us, right? And like the problem that the technology has to solve is like a problem that is a global problem, right? So I don't think it's like, I think they like probably make things more complex, but they're trying to address an issue that's really more complex. Do you know what I mean? So I don't think you can go in the less complex direction. Does that make sense? Answer me, because I can see you're not satisfied. Yeah?
Well, like the choice is not between making it less complex or more complex. It's about maintaining the level of the complexity or making it more complex.
Okay.
And that's where like I'm lost. I'm a technologist. I make these platforms for a living. So,
Okay.
but I also have questions about
Yeah. But
the ultimate effect of
yeah.
those platforms.
Yeah. I don't know, but I think we need them. Is kind of what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
Yeah. What do you think?
My hunch is that we do, but I need like more or critical people who can't be critical and saying like, no, what you're doing is wrong, or for this and this and this reasons. And I haven't been able to like get a tangible,
Like you haven't had like detailed critiques of what is
yeah.
the right and the wrong way to do it.
Right.
Yeah. And I don't think that like, I just spent a year in Silicon Valley and like,
Oh no, that's
they're
the
not
wrong place to
critical.
look for
Yeah,
that.
yeah. There's not a lot of critical discourse in like the tech world. Yeah.
You want to say anything else? This is very general. You said something about scale. Can we throw in, can I bring in that question for you who design and you who are studying the design? There seems to, the question of complexity, there's complexity that reflects larger social complexity, and there's complexity that actually obfuscates and makes things harder, right? Can you make that distinction? Is that a distinction that you're making in a way? Because, right? there's technology that can reflect a social complexity. Like we need to have people who are unable to communicate verbally, have them be a part of the communication. So we're going to create a network and a protocol for that to happen, both technologically but also in person. And that's complexity, right? But it's reflecting the complexity that exists within that social situation, right?
Yeah.
And which allows them for scaling, which allows for including more people.
Yeah.
Am I right about this?
Like the problem with scale is that, referring back to complexity theory, is that systems replicate each other at different scales, kind of fractally. But also they have emergent properties that you cannot predict just by scaling linearly, right? So if you scale, when you scale not the problems from just like a small community, us in this room, to a city, to a state, you get emergent effects that are or emergent properties of those systems that actually you simply cannot predict. And that's where tools like agent-based modeling comes in, because then it allows you to model systems in a way that's depending on how you represent the system, it allows for different predictions or different behaviors to emerge based on those models. And actually, it might be an interesting simulation to run with some of those tools that you're describing, how an agent-based model, what kind of behaviors can we expect from a certain crowd in a certain system making certain decisions using those tools. Maybe that's one of your research projects.
No, it made me think of this quote actually, because he was saying how the collective intelligent is not an emergent property, right? That it's like it's based on this idea of the general will. It's based on will, right? It's based on deliberation and thinking about what's best, and it's not. I feel like there's in what you're describing, there's an idea that there's something that's sort of beyond human agency that's emerging, or something like that. We can't
I use emergent in a very, very technical sense from complexity theory. I don't know if this is interesting, but I'm using it in a very technical sense because in complexity theory, it's like the difference between a simple and complicated and a complex system. A simple system is like a seesaw. Complicated system, it's like an airplane. You can take it apart and put it back together, and you can actually understand the function of every component. In a complex system, if you take a society apart, you cannot put it back together, right? And that's where emergent properties come in. By people interacting with each other, you get based on specific rules, you get behavior that's simply unpredictable from examining the individual components of a society, or any other complex system. It could be a city, it could be a cell, it could be an ecosystem, right? So I think when we ask questions about how those tools actually affect decision making, collective decision making in a society, I think this is where a really interesting research question can be posed, and particularly I know like Facebook is facing exactly that problem. And Mohammed was talking about how Facebook is unable to like regulate. First, they don't have a transparent algorithm for what they show on in the newsfeed, and they're simply unable to regulate what happens in the emergent the emergent behavior that comes due to their algorithm, the rules that they've set towards the interaction between individuals and entities on their social network. So, I don't know, I'm rambling at this one.
Yeah,
Jackson, you want to
I take your point though, yeah, it's a great question.
In terms of the sort of, there were, I guess, 5 situations, 5 squares that you evaluated.
Yep.
And in terms of like speaking about the now and the concepts of movement building and sort of emergent ideas of a new internationalism and the idea that these are testing grounds for this technology and this use of technology, did you find that these movements were conscious of the need to find places to share their experiences so that other movements had the opportunities to also learn from their skill sets, their abilities, and their actual on-the-ground experiences?
Yeah, totally. And I haven't like spoken about that because I'm more thinking about like democratic process, but like sort of going back to what you were saying about indie media, like there's a need for like ways for these movements to archive what they've done and communicate and share. And YouTube is, they have videos on YouTube, they have websites, some of them. A lot of it, like there's still this old-fashioned practice of like raising money to like fly people out to talk to you, and there are all these people who came from Spain and like gave them advice, and they changed their processes based on the way things went badly in Spain. So
that's weird though, isn't it? I mean, the idea that there's so many technologically capable people that aren't using their tools to inform each other. So like for me, when you harken back to the early 2000s and the movements, like one of the things that was very much in place that still got destroyed no matter how powerful it seemed by 911, there was a sense that they were trying to learn from the protest actions of others. The Abasta movement in Italy, that there was just a whole, and they were, the EZLN, the Zapatistas, like there was all of these like models in a time when the communication and technology wasn't as prolific even as it is now, and it just seems like an opportunity missed, and so much information. If they're not doing it, I'm not saying that but the idea is that even the IMCs represented a weird collective repository for that,
Yeah.
and it just seems like a big disconnect with the movement building that's happening here, that those connections aren't more present in the discussion.
It is happening. Like there are archives and websites. There's the 15Mpedia. It's kind of amazing. It's like a Wikipedia for 15M. Like it's happening. I think it's not. It's like the problem with open source projects. There's like a funding and sustainability issue, as always.
Go ahead.
So during during the Occupy movement, you said that they usually ban certain apps like Telegram and Kindle because they did encryption, which means no third party can see what the messaging is. Now I'm saying now my question is when these platforms or soft platforms are being developed, they usually have encryption in mind, saying that okay, so no government would actually see what's being sent or what messages are being sent. Okay. But wouldn't that go against what Jimmy said about that it's not open source, there's no openness or no plain text to it?
I think it depends on like where the openness is supposed to be. Like actually, I think like everyone loves the encryption. It's just like, it's like that CIA thing, the confidentiality, integrity, accessibility. The integrity part, well, it's both. It's the idea that the message gets from the person who wants to send it to the person they want to send it to, right? So if you want to send it like from your mouth to the entire assembly, then like, maybe you don't need encryption, or right, maybe you just need to do it in an assembly, or maybe you need encryption so that only people in the group can hear it, right? But if you want to send it, like if I'm trying to tell you something like, hey, I'm going to the protest, there's tear gas, bring a scarf, and I don't want the government to listen to that, right? It's not like anti-democratic, right? It's not, I don't know, I think like I understand what you're saying, that like maybe everything should just be open.
No, I'm kind of completely against the action for encryption. I'm just saying maybe there was different schools of thought, so maybe encryption should be allowed, encryption should be allowed. As I can see, there was a consensus like, okay, encryption should be a must and should be included.
Yeah, I think there's not, I think the question is more about like, where do you draw the boundaries around the community that you're protecting with the encryption? And like, usually when people are using those apps, like like you're using it to talk to one of your friends, right? It's usually one-to-one, or maybe you make a group with it, right? But you probably don't, like, can you make an entire protest that's like on an encrypted app? Like maybe. So it's more, I think it's more a question of like, how big is that group that you're protecting? And who are you protecting it from? You know what I mean?
Yeah. Can I ask another question? Okay, so most of these tools were kind of developed like on the spot. I don't feel like there was much about, there couldn't have been much about the time. And usually encryption takes a bit of hands-on work and whatnot. Was that always set as a priority because they feel, okay, we need to get the encryption right and then work on everything else?
Only in Cairo, I think. Yeah, and it's because like a lot of the people working on it were securities engineers who kind of, I'm sorry, I have a cold, so I'm really quiet. I hope everyone can hear it. In Cairo, it was really important. I think in Turkey it's pretty important too, but that like I know the people on the team designing that, like they were securities engineers, like that was their job in life, you know, and so they were worried about it, and so some of it was like in the works already and continues to be worked on. Yeah. And like signal telegram, that's multi-year long projects. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you for your talk, it was great. When I think of like, I guess tools and movements over these new past, like I first think of like Anonymous and IRC channels that people were on, and now like Signal for protest, but Signal doesn't scale to the way that, you know, it would be feasibly used. Can you think of any tools or apps now that would have changed the outcome of Occupy? I know that's
It's such a good question, right? Like something that exists now that didn't exist then. I don't know. I mean, I think like I was excited about the mesh network, and those are like easier to build now. Would it have changed the outcome of Occupy? I think Occupy ended because the police came in the middle of the night and shut down the chaos. So, like, I think what is going to change the outcome is going to be like longer term sustained, like movement building. Or like if you look at something like the Egyptian Revolution, like what would have changed the outcome would have been like if there was something in place that could have like allowed it to continue after the moment of revolution. You know, like I think like what's interesting about these tools is about like can we design infrastructures and like practices that endure? And that's kind of, so I'm thinking more about endurance than outcome, I guess. Yeah. This is such a good question.
I think we should we can stop the formal conversation and then we can break up a little bit, and if people want to talk to Jessica individually, they can do that. And we can figure out if there's other need to come together again for Jessica leaves. If you want to talk to her a long-term basis, we can figure that out. But I thank you for coming, thank you for staying, and I thank Jessica very much for